Science Forum is bound to inspire many people about a world of unending possibilities as well as unending opportunities. A world where imagination, innovation, and scientific discovery can allow all of us to dream of a better, more secure, and even a more equitable future.
The Forum seeks to build on our objective of providing a vibrant support base for the expansion of research and innovation on the African continent in partnership with the global science community.
The aim is to put African scientists at the cutting edge of contemporary data-intensive science. They have demonstrated the core value of open science, which is quality, integrity, collective benefit, equity, fairness, diversity and inclusiveness. And so this scientific humanism in a troubled world is at the heart of our endeavors for a peaceful world.
As scientists from all corners of the world, you know that science knows no country and no boundaries, because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world. The content focus of this year's Science Forum will serve to complement the outcome of the World Science Forum 2022 and its focus on science and social justice.
We at INGSA aim to be more and more global by engaging all stakeholders and interacting with all subgroups of civil society. This is why the World Science Forum in Cape Town in December is so important for us. I hope to see you there.
I am excited that the World Science Forum is going to be right here in South Africa.
Well, we believe that conversation about science, dialogue amongst partners, is absolutely critical for the scientific enterprise to progress.
Will be an ideal opportunity to launch South Africa to the world.
We've already had some glimpse of what those kinds of discussions would be, and they are enormously exciting.
South Africa is a place that most people from around the world have some sense of. It's been this kind of proof of concept of all the major ideas of modern society.
Come here, let's just demonstrate to you the ability of Africa in terms of showing how our value in AI is.
Don't miss out. It's going to be exciting, jam-packed with a lot of innovation, a lot of inspiring stories, and yeah, science all the way.
Science Forum South Africa is evolving into a powerful platform for advancing science, technology and innovation in the continent. Viva Africa! Thank you!
If COVID-19 is the 9/11 moment for global science advice, what needs to happen next?
This is a social pandemic that we haven't solved for millennia now.
Let's try to do all together to get rid of this bloody virus.
The hardest group is actually the scientists, because the scientists actually want to have access to power.
There are different pathways to truths and claims that we make about understanding our world.
People want scientists to have outreach more.
We need to fix something globally.
Where is this voice of Africa in all of this?
We as Africans, we need to think not on along nationalist terms. We need to think in continental terms.
And without that global community working together, the problems that the planet faces cannot be addressed.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 3, 2, 1, and you're live.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this session of Science Forum South Africa 2021. I have an esteemed selection of panelists from all over the world. And this particular session has been put together by Aidan Gilligan from SciCom, Making Sense of Science. And Aidan, I want to also congratulate you with now having an office in Cape Town, South Africa. So who do I have on my panel? Well, as co-organizer and speaker, I have Professor Remy Quiron from Canada. Remy from the field of psychiatry and neuroscience, and is currently the chief scientist of Quebec and president of the International Network for Governmental Science and Advice, or INGSA. A role that is inherited from one of our other speakers, the esteemed Sir Peter Gluckman from New Zealand, who is currently the president of the International Science Council and former chief advisor to 3 different presidents or prime ministers, of New Zealand. Peter himself is a pediatrician and biomedical scientist. Coming from Estonia, I have Professor Enna Erma, who is an astronomist and former politician and speaker of the Estonian parliament. And then joining us all the way from Japan is Miyoko Watanabe, who, as a scientist, played with semiconductor physics and is now the executive director of the Japan Science and Technology Agency. And listen to this, more importantly, the director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusivity. So welcome to you, Miyoko, all the way from Japan. And last but not least is my dear friend and colleague from a previous life, Professor Derek Schwartz, who is a doyen in ocean sciences. And for his sins, he currently serves as the special advisor to our Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, Dr. Bladen Zamane, and is the Chief Strategy Advisor for Ocean Sciences at Nelson Mandela University. So colleagues, you can see why I am so excited, because these scientists have managed to take the collective experience from the science and to package it at that interface of science and policy. And this is what we want to talk about today. We said that if you could, and I want to re-emphasize what the title is, because it was recently updated in the abstract. And the title is, if COVID-19 is the 9/11 moment for global science advice, what needs to happen next? So colleagues, that's the topic. But before we venture into what happens next, I think we need to contextualize how is it that you have all come to this party and how you would view your collective experience to date in how you have managed to bridge that very large rift that exists between science on the one hand and policy on the other. And of course, there is another kid on the block, and that is politics. How do we manage this science and policy structure in lieu of politics? So what I'm going to do is give you a few minutes to give me give the audience a kind of a succinct preview into the kind of roles you have played in interfacing the science policy juncture. What worked? What didn't work? What would some of your messages be? So I think I would start with Professor Erna Echma, if we could ask you to give us some of your reflections, ma'am. Over to you.
Dear colleagues, it is really a pleasure to participate in this meeting, and thanks Aidan and Himla for inviting me. And I would like to give some word how I managed to be involved to the politics. I have been educated from Moscow University and long time worked in the research institute in Moscow as astrophysicist. And 1988, I was elected to be the professor of astrophysics in Tartu University in Estonia. I hope that you maybe know that Estonia is a very young country. We regained our independence only 30 years ago. And before that, Estonia was part of Soviet Union with its own research system, where research and higher education were separated. For a small country, this system is very expensive. And after regaining independence, we tried to build up the new system where higher education and research were together. And during this time, when I was in Estonia and returned back from Moscow, I was involved in all the reorganization processes which took place in Estonian research. It was really very exciting and hard time with small money for research and need to understand, we must understand which direction of research we can support and which not. As you can understand, being the part of large country, it is completely different to be a small country with 1 million, little bit more than 1 million people. Many of you understand it is only the part of, for example, large city, Tokyo or Quebec and so on. We are so small. But 10 years later, after independence, I thought that our policymakers pay too little attention to the future of Estonian science. And I make the strange decision to join one political party since I thought that it's better to influence political decision using to be inside the game. For my great surprise, I was elected at first, and after that, 2 or 3 weeks later, I was elected to be the Speaker of Parliament and remain in this position fully 10 years. As you can understand, it is enough time to learn what is the politics inside, really. And what lessons have I learned? And this is my own lessons, as you can understand. The first and very important, if scientists and policymakers can do great job if they have the same goals. For example, the famous Apollo program. I hope that next success story, where scientists and policymakers are working together, we can see after this pandemic. It would be very painful victory with lot of victims, but main thing is that working together we will receive best result. I hope so. I am optimistic about this. Second lesson, the policymakers expect the researchers to give a very quickly good result. Then the policymakers can look like the heroes when they have supported this successful project. But the problem is that the research timescale to achieve good results must be much longer than the timescale between the successful election, which is important for politicians. Third lesson, people on street are not necessarily very interested in science. And unfortunately, several large technological disasters, as Chernobyl, also COVID-19, have increased people's distrust to science and scientists. But the policymakers are very sensible to public opinion. And last, fourth, political parties are mainly interested in ratings and votes. Unfortunately, the number of scientists in different countries are usually very small to compare the for example, number of public school teachers or retired people. So political parties are paying main attention to needs of this group of people, not to scientists. There was this 4 point, but I want to be more optimistic. I want to say you that during this time when I was the Speaker of Parliament, I managed to realize one very useful project, and I hope this is the project for the youngsters, as well for Estonian economy and science. After 9 years of hard work in work, Estonia was expected to be the full member of European Space Agency. And I realized that for me, it was much easier to do this project because I was close contact with Prime Minister and ministers. When I achieved it, I left politics. But my main advice is, if we want to support the researchers, and very strongly, we need strong lobby group in the Parliament. 1 or 2 persons is not enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those wise words, Enna. I'm sure we'll come to some of those points in the discussion. To the audience who are participating, please, you're welcome to join in and post your questions. Our colleagues at the office will help us to stream those questions through to me so that I could relay that to the panelists. Okay, let's now hear from Sir Peter. Over to you.
I started life as a medical scientist. I ended up being dean of a medical school, then setting up a medical research institute. And in 2000, had a lot of scientific acclaim. And in 2009, I was asked to be the first chief science advisor to a Prime Minister of New Zealand. The real role was to help the Prime Minister and the government of New Zealand to use evidence better in policy making. Everything else was secondary to helping the government use evidence more importantly. It was not primarily about advancing science for science's sake. It was about evidence to impact on public policy. And that was interesting because as I developed the science advisory mechanism over time, we put a lot of emphasis on social sciences as much as on natural sciences, because of course, from a government's point of view, the issues in the social sector are far more expensive and complicated than they are in the natural science sector. To do the job, I decided right at the outset, I needed to understand how policy and policy making and politics worked. And so I spent a lot of time in getting it clear what the role was. I could not be the expert at everything. I didn't have to be the expert on anything. I had to be the translator, the interpreter between the science community and the political and policy community. And that led me into thinking a lot about the logic of science advice. I founded, and Remy was in there at the beginning, and for 8 years I chaired INGSA, and now I chair the International Science Council. And I think the logic was to understand that there are 2 separate tasks. There's the task of synthesizing the evidence, and that needs to be done in a pluralistic way. It's best done often by academies or appropriate groups to bring the evidence together. but the communication of that evidence to the policy community and the communication of the needs to from the policy and political community to the science community is a different skill set. And I think where science advice goes well, it tends to recognize the need to separate synthesis and brokerage. They are not the same thing. And I think that's very important to understand. Furthermore, evidence synthesis, which is often done around the world by academies or groups like that, usually ends up being a report. But in fact, the brokerage of science advice to a politician or a senior policymaker depends so much more on diplomatic skills of understanding that policy making is not just based on evidence, but is based on a lot of values-based issues like fiscal priority, electoral priorities, diplomatic considerations, public opinion, political ideology. That's the normative and appropriate part of policy making in a democracy. And a science advisor needs to know how to navigate that while still not compromising on the nature of the evidence. But it means translating it into language that they understand and aligning with the values to the extent you can of what they see to be important. And that's a skill. And it relies on certain characteristics: humility, trust. You must have trusted relationships with the politicians, and I include the opposition in that regard. It must be apolitical. It must include trust with the senior policymakers, and you will have contestations with them, but you need to do it in a civil and diplomatic way. You need trust with the media. You need trust with civil society. The hardest group is actually the scientists, because the scientists actually want to have access to power on their own account. And there's often competition, and we've seen this during COVID, a lot of competition for access to power. And that can end up with the poor old prime minister or politician needing to act as a scientific referee. And that's not what they can be. That's why you need good evidence brokerage and good evidence synthesis. Now, there are multiple models of developing this. I'm not claiming that the Anglophone model of the chief science advisor is the only way of doing it. But you do need to have a mechanism for evidence synthesis, and that may need, that as we've said, needs to be appropriate to the situation in play. And you need to have proper processes of giving scientific brokerage, evidence brokerage, risk brokerage to the executive of government. And so within the constitution and history of any country, there are ways of achieving that. But without that, you end up with, I'm afraid, big reports that don't get read in language that cannot be understood by those that need to do it, and a risk of misunderstanding between the policy community and the science community, the political community and the science community. So I'll stop there, Himla, in the interest of time.
No, that's excellent words of advice, and I'm sure we're going to revisit this. So let me bring in Miyoko. Miyoko, would you like to give us your thoughts on this topic?
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for arranging this session, Aidan and Himura. So I'd like to share the data I have in my talk. So let me share. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to show you the situation of COVID-19 pandemic in Japan. This picture shows the daily new positive cases in Japan from March last year to yesterday. We experienced the pandemic waves 5 times, and now the pandemic is calm. We don't know the exact reason why the pandemic is calm now in Japan, but we can guess some reasons. The first is the ratio of vaccination. It is high, now 77%, that for teenagers about 70%. We started vaccine late in February this year, but practical Start time was in May, and many people had vaccination in a short period. So we maybe have herd immunity now. The reason of high vaccination ratio is due to education of citizens. People know what is virus, what is vaccine, and the effect of vaccine. The second reason is our custom of wearing a mask and washing hands. The third is Japan is an island country. We can travel to and from overseas only by airplanes and ships, so that it is easy to control it at the airport and port. So let me examine the relation between the vaccination and education. This shows a result of a report of SDGs Dashboard Index focusing on SDG 4 quality education. The upper table shows the level of SDG 4 in the countries. Japan is assigned as level for highest level here. The lower this table shows the SDG 4 level and each country's second vaccination rate finished as of last week. We can see last tendency. Well-educated countries have high vaccination ratio. So next, I show you the data of wearing a mask. The pink line over here shows the data of Asia Pacific. The green shows the Middle East, the light blue shows the Americas, and the purple lines shows Europe. When the pandemic started at the beginning of last year, the wearing mask ratios were very high in Asia. So we have custom to wear the mask before the COVID-19 pandemic started. So that it was not hard for us to wear a mask. We can notice it was harder in other areas. So far, I talked about the citizens' potential and responsibility. Actually, citizens had a big contribution to the pandemic in Japan. Next, let me talk about the scientist responsibility with the image of science. The left, this picture shows the science. It has a lot of disciplines. All of the scientists know it, but many citizens have an image shown over here. Science means physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. What is the image of these disciplines? I show you typical image of physics. I am originally a physicist, so let me show you the case of physics. In the world of physics, we treat only closed system where we can set formation and boundary conditions. We can get a unique solution with this small, well-defined world. But real society is different. It is an open system where we cannot define general formation and boundary conditions. We cannot get a unique solution, and we have to estimate multiple solutions. What I would like to say here is citizens expect a unique solution for the real society problems for science. It's impossible. We have to tell the limit of science, and the science can give us only multiple solutions estimated. So we should think about citizens' potential and responsibility, adding to the responsibility of scientists and politicians. So citizens need education that lead to fairness, and the scientists should need convergence of knowledge more. It can lead to inclusiveness, and the politicians should need scientific knowledge more that lead to transparency. I did not talk about the politicians' responsibility. I will talk it as a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Nyoko. That's quite clear and succinct, and very nice to see how behavior and attitudes have contributed to keeping the levels of the COVID pandemic down and compliance for vaccination. So nicely brought into the discussion. All right. So Derek, you've heard from some of our colleagues, and I'd like to bring you into the conversation now so that you could share with us some of the experiences that you've had in the South African environment. Over to you, Derek.
My route into policy advice is, I guess, probably rather unorthodox in this case. And I am a social scientist by training, Himmler. And but I spent much of my days before this role, prior to this, some few decades ago, as an anti-apartheid activist, seeking democratic change, transformation in our system, and spend a decade of my life in exile, and then came back to serve, 2 stints as vice chancellor of 2 universities in South Africa before, much belatedly, might I add, joining, the belly of the beast. And so I'm, unlike my other colleagues, I'm pretty new to this, adventure. And it's a steep learning curve. All these years I've been standing outside of the system, and now I'm inside the system and having to deal with all its contradictions and paradoxes and limits, of course, as well. And so I indeed, I'm learning from this conversation tremendously also. But reflecting on my own understanding of the Zealand colleagues is, of course, I think, for me at least, the world of science and science making and politics are 2 different domains, so to speak. I think one of my colleagues spoke quite eloquently about the nature of the differences. They essentially orbit around different sort of like centers of gravity, if you like, or reference points. Science is about evidence making, the refutation of truth claims and theories and hypotheses, using the Popperian logic, so to speak. Politics is about, as my colleague from New Zealand was saying, about power, about electability, about serving constituencies, about making difficult choices amongst different things in the context of a scarcity of resources. Now they do, of course, interface, but I cannot see from myself how they can completely overlap, so to speak, because they, in a sense, they appeal to different internal logics. And I guess the question for me is what are the sort of bridges that we need to build from science and scientific advice into the political realm in such a way that we keep the integrity of science intact. But as my colleague from New Zealand was saying, is to synthesize from that lessons or evidence that we can present, as a basis for hopefully rational policy calculus and decision making in the political system. Whether that is done in that way, of course, depends on a whole range of other things that, most of my colleagues would know that life is much more complicated in that regard. And so they are distinct realms of reference in a way, but that traditional system, if you like, is increasingly under pressure today from 2 sort of sources that I can see. One is the proliferation of democratic claims on the state. With the advancement of democratic norms across the world, citizens are demanding more and more from governments, from state institutions, and indeed from the scientific establishment too, to provide the sort of answers to the vexing, the wicked problems facing us in the early to the mid-21st century, so to speak. And I do think that is in difference from perhaps previous decades. There's much, much more expectation from citizens across our nations, demanding more, from our governments, our states, and indeed from our scientific and technological establishments as well. And then the second one is a set of structural pressures that are imposing itself upon this science policy-making interface in ways that perhaps is unprecedented, at least in recent decades. And this flows from a range of huge problems on a planetary scale facing humanity. And indeed, this science policy-making interface has to, in a sense, wrestle with these big problems. Problems of climate change, of course. We know that the biophysical characteristics, of how we live on the planet, all that is under stress now because of global warming, the acidification of our oceans, and so on. And that imposes, a set of challenges to our traditional systems that are based on nation states and individual governments thinking about finding solutions for their populaces. And these problems tend to transcend those national boundaries and poses some very serious challenges for us thinking about this interface as well. And of course, economic globalization is another phenomenon that, increasingly the world is being pushed and, integrated. Its financial, trading, production systems, value chains are increasingly being intermeshed and fundamentally becoming much more interdependent upon each other in that sense. And again, you cannot therefore make policies based on evidence, only thinking about yourself in a particular local context. It has to be done coterminous or parallel with what is happening in the rest of the world as well. And then, of course, the phenomenon of technological disruption, and again, all the maladies and challenges that come from that as well. And the problem of growing social inequality across the world is a social pandemic that we haven't solved for millennia now. And then, of course, as Zimla was saying earlier on in reference to the COVID-19 pandemic, is, of course, the specter of new health pandemics also cascading across the world in ways that was unprecedented in future decades as such. And so these kinds of planetary existential challenges are impinging upon this traditional interface that we've shaped based on nation states, and in particular ways to cope with problems at a local, provincial, regional, and national level, but hardly in a kind of a pan-national or a global level as well. And I think these pressures are also calling upon us to rethink some of the ways in which we fashion this interface between policy making, if you like, and scientific advice. Things around aspects I'm thinking about is how do we harness better the insights of transboundary or transdisciplinary knowledge in the policy-making space, these amazing tools that are now becoming available to us to think through the management of our responses to climate adaptation and mitigation, of technological disruption of millions of our people from work and the changing nature of work. How do we harness these incredible tools of multidisciplinary thinking to help us to find new pathways to the future that are more sustainable? It also puts into question our thinking about government as agents of looking after citizens and the limits of government itself. How do we strike social compacts between, particularly in instances where governments have limited capacities and there are, all sorts of problems with respect to the efficiency and the optimality of government? How does it work with civil society, with labor, with business, in striking social compacts that can, help with the transition to a more sustainable futures as well? And then thirdly, it also calls into question, the limits of nationalism. I'm a student of nationalism and the limits of nation states. Right now, we have to think, about planetary solutions. We need to think at regional, continental scale and develop policy regimes that can help us to interface in more effective ways to tackle problems that cut across our borders, whether we like it or not, the Omicron, variant has spread, despite the fact that we have all these nationalistic or linguistic boundaries that we've set up, for the last few hundreds or thousands of years. And so the kinds of solutions that I'm personally looking at is ways in which we can begin to revisit some of the assumptions on the basis of which we develop tools, policy tools for dealing with these issues. And I think science obviously has a critical place to play in this regard. Thank you very much, Imlak. I'll join the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek. It was a very good take on being a new kid on the block, and I really enjoyed listening to some of your insights. Right, it now remains for me to invite the co-organizer of this session, Remy. Remy, you've listened to what our colleagues have had to say, and I'd like to hear your points of view. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Imla, and thanks to Aidan also to help to put the session together, and the colleague also. I enjoy your brief presentation, the challenge, especially the last speaker, democracy, government of tomorrow, nationalism, certainly very key. My side, well, a background in mental health, psychiatry, that probably helped me in my day job over the past 10 years. And maybe some of the key words, let's say, that I learned, maybe I would say pre-pandemic keywords. And I think you all touch on that, relationship. As a scientist, relationship with high-level policymaker, relationship with politicians. Knowing each other, that takes a bit of time. Trusting each other, very, very, very critical. And this is very hard to build in a crisis mode, like we saw during the pandemic. So proper science advice mechanism, I would say, must be in place, must be agile, must be flexible in normal, in quote, normal time, so that you're able to respond to some extent during crisis. Relationship come with trust, very key, and transparency. I think that's something that certainly we have to learn, and we saw that during the pandemic. What is known, what is not known. And of course, sometimes, well, usually, I should say, elected official, politician, they don't like that. They would prefer to have, yes, I know this is this thing, and the science advice I'm giving you is the following. So again, with the pandemic, we started knowing, we knew very, very, very little. Another key word, at least for me, the way we are set up in Quebec and in Canada, I'll say is resilience. Over the past 10 years, 4 different governments from 3 different parties, center, right, and left, 3 different colors on the spectrum that we have in Quebec. So resilience and knowing to being able to adapt to a new master and keeping the trust and confidence of the new leader. 2 years ago, like for all of you, the pandemic hit us, and we had these well-established relationships, the trust, we had that. But then it was almost a 24/7 type of job. So a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety on the level of politician, high-level policymaker, and science advisor, because we are basing our advice, talking with colleagues worldwide, on limited information. Should we, I think a colleague from Japan talk about mask. Well, in Canada, we're not used to wear masks. So should we wear masks or not? Say no. Then the week later or 2 weeks later, say, well, maybe, and then yes. So for the politician, a bit hard. The vaccine, and after the first trial, should we have between the 2 doses? Should we have 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks. Decision in Quebec has been to extend it a little bit just because we did not have enough doses to properly vaccinate. But in the end, that was a good decision. Turned out that was more effective that way. But we did not have these data at the beginning. So we took a risk as a science advice, but also the politician agreed and took the risk. The good side of things, I say, is science. Pose challenge, but science, and was especially open science. Access to data globally. And science has never been as visible daily. Some scientists became almost star. And I think it gave us also, and that's something hopefully we'll not lose, gave us the opportunity to explain a bit more to our high-level policymaker, elected official, and to civil society, to the public, explain a bit more the scientific method. So that's not necessarily what's on the front page of the New York Times. That is necessarily the truth. We are learning. So the scientific method takes time, as some of you had mentioned. So I think now they understand that a bit better. And again, here I stress transparency. What you know, what you don't know is very, very critical. Maybe a flip side of that, fake news and disinformation was mentioned, quite limited in Quebec and in Canada compared to what we may see south of the border in the US. But with social media, challenge, and we cannot forget about it. Even if it's small, at this time, let's say in our country, we have to try to understand that better. Social science would be absolutely critical there. We have to find ways to discuss with civil society more directly, and maybe with a different type of language, because otherwise I'm concerned, and I think it was mentioned by the last speaker, about our democracy, the impact that this could have eventually on our democracy. So I think this is very key, and we have to make more effort in terms of science education, scientific education, scientific literacy for all our population, and we must make sure that we do not leave anyone behind. Immigrant, in Canada, native community. So social inequality certainly will put stress on these various issues. Moving on, so I think hopefully getting out of the pandemic sooner than later, what I think our government realized that we need to have a strong in-house, internal science advice mechanism to adapt advice sometime to the local scene. But of course, these problems are global. So we have to have link with the rest of the world to have a rapid exchange. And that's a role, for example, for INGSA and for the ISC. So I think very, very important to have that, because the next challenge, and I think it was discussed briefly, like climate change, sustainable development, to make sure that our planet and us will kind of be able to carry on. Challenges are huge and will not come, of course, from a small province like Quebec. It will need global solution, huge, huge challenge, and hopefully we'll have learned something from that pandemic that will be able to apply to other challenges like climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. Colleagues, thank you very much for your insights. And if you look at the gist of the conversation, certain themes have kind of evolved from what you've contributed thus far. And the one theme that I want to pick up and to start off our kind of collective discussion on is the role of the so-called third force, the public. The public has been strongly empowered in recent times, as Remy has said, with open access and open science. Information is freely available. I mean, sometimes even us as scientists, the first time we hear about things are through social media. before you could even get to the evidence. So I would like to go first to Nyoko. Nyoko, you showed in your presentation the kind of support for policy, etc., from the public. What are your successes in being able to reach out to the public to get them to buy into what the governments have been saying with respect to social distancing, non-pharmaceutical interventions like mask wearing, and of course, taking up the vaccines? How much of an effort was it for the government to, get this into the public space? Was there resistance, and if so, from whom, and how did you deal with it? Over to you, Naoko.
Yeah, Japanese public people would like to know a lot of knowledge about the pandemic, and of course, every day we have a news about the pandemic, and then a lot of information we have, but and the information available about COVID-19, but public people don't access to the scientific evidence directly. They will go to the news item and something like that. But the very important thing is scientists to have outreach about COVID-19. The best practice is Professor Yamanaka. Maybe you know, he's a Nobel laureate, and he's a scientist of IPS cell. He's not the expert in infectious disease and public health, but he always say he wants to do something about the pandemic. He has a lot of outreach toward citizens every day, almost every day, and public people trust him. He's a very reliable person, and he explains COVID-19 at TV program very often. Many of our citizens act on his suggestion. This is a very good example.
The issue that is key is the vertical trust in society. There's a high level of trust between government and citizens in some countries, and in those countries, trust in science, trust in elites, trust in policymakers, trust in politicians, all has some overlap. And I think where we've seen a lot of vaccine hesitancy, a lot of lack of compliance, it's been low trust in government or low trust in elites that have flown through to undermine the ability of science to break through. But I think there's a word that we've used loosely here we need to think about hard, and that's the word evidence. We think of evidence as scientific evidence done through the robust processes of natural or social sciences, and we all understand what that means. But to most people, evidence is more than that. All said and done in the court of law, evidence is contested. And if you think about how normal people get their evidence, it is from the media, it is from films, it's from reading books, it's from watching television, it's from anecdote, and we all have dealt with the people who say, well, it didn't work that way for me, so it can't be true. It is from the taxi driver, and politicians. Anecdote and observation from their constituents is probably the most singular, important part of evidence. And we're seeing in some countries, religious belief, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge are all forms of evidence. And science is not automatically put on a pedestal and given a privileged position against other forms of evidence. And one of the roles of a good science advice system is to acknowledge that there are other forms of knowledge and not deprecate them, but respect them and use a respectful approach through in navigating with the policy and the political community, who all said and done are just the same as ordinary citizens. That's how they get their evidence. And I think we must be very careful about this word evidence, that it's not just scientific evidence.
No, that's
And
a
of
point.
course,
Well,
in an age of misinformation,
yeah,
evidence, even if it's allegedly robust, oh, I've done my research and my research says that the vaccine is not safe, that you can search your way, and we all understand how disinformation is cleverly using their databases now and cherry picking to create misinformation and political advantage. So there's a lot here that science has to contest with.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know, and I'm just wondering if I can bring you in at this stage. Given what Peter has just said, how would you, given your role in the political sphere, deal with other lines of evidence, as Peter has told us now? How would you use that in policy making, and how would you use that in disseminating information to the public?
Thank you. For me, it is very important that we start to tell very simple languages. You see, scientists usually like to show that they are very clever and using words, very, very complicated words. But we try to explain, for example, I was thinking how to explain, for example, what's happened when we got inside this virus. Can you visualize it?
Yeah.
So, for example, through the TV, at least the young kids can see it. But the second thing is, I think we need better communication. And fortunately enough, in Estonia, you see young people who are studying medicine. They are now doing such project, for example, to sending, please ask me question about the COVID.
Yeah.
What is it? And I try to explain you. No, you see, privately, what we are thinking this. Because I don't believe, you see, always the government advice is accepted like some power. You must accept it. For me, this was very strange when I saw that nowadays more than 20–30%, it is almost the same, I think, many countries are against the vaccination. I remember the time I am one generation after Second World War, when each year we went to the school sister and received something in our hands. And nobody told you about this at home, and nobody asked us.
Yeah.
And we avoid lot of diseases, which was very, very, very hard diseases for the kids this time. So you see, for me it is very important how we can explain through the social media. Although you must remember that people, elder people, they are not inside the social media. That is youngsters.
Right.
But also, you see, it is necessary not to tell you that, you see, it is something terrible. Let's try to do all together to get rid of this bloody virus. But you must explain. It's very simple languages.
Yes.
Sometimes we have the very nice, the Science Advisory Committee, but they also try to, you see, they are scientists, I can understand them. They are thinking that to explain very simple way, that means that it is so simple. What is the problem? How you can taste it? But you can see it is difficult. Yeah, I think about what I am talking about the communication. You see, I was thinking about, you see, the latest large pandemic was almost 100 years ago, at least one for Europe, and also for the United States and America and so on. And you see, after that, people have forgotten that it may happen. Yeah. Why Japanese and all the Asia people are more prepared? because they have some sort of small pandemic. No swine pandemic, birds pandemic, but it never arrived the same level to the Europe. And I think we were very careless. We were not prepared. Medicine is something which everybody knows how to deal with it by help, the internet, by Google and so on. But about such kind of pandemic, do you remember that there was some information how you can behave if something happened? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe your countries have already prepared for this. Maybe Japanese is always very well prepared for large disasters. But I don't know. Peter, how about New Zealand? Can you tell me? Are you ready for it? Are the people ready for such kind of pandemic? At least in
my judgment, nobody is ready for it. I think the global system is not ready. I think it's shocking that 2 years on nearly, we are still fighting as to whether there should be a new pandemic treaty at WHO. That's clearly the WHO system is not ready. The global warning system was not ready. Logical advice, support to lower middle income countries was not appropriate. The international health regulations were no longer fit for purpose. And only now is there debate starting at WHO about whether there should be a new pandemic treaty or a new international instrument. Quite clearly one is needed. This is an indictment that the multilateral system is not in good position to deal with the global crises of the global commons. You could argue the same thing about the recent COP26. And let's face it, the result of COP26 was disappointing, pedestrian, and despite the political claims of success, it's not dealing with the issues that are fundamentally there. And the issues that are there are not just those of technological change, the issues of how the global community comes to work with each other, issues of how we get societies and individuals to change their behaviours. And so we've got a real issue, and what I think Derek mentioned it in his presentation, a conflict between nationalism, which drives short-term interests by definition, and the reality that we're now facing, because of a whole lot of reasons, issues that affect the global commons. And that is the issue just look at the distribution of vaccine. If we talk now about the issues of vaccine distribution, vaccine supply, vaccine uptake, etc., I think I don't need to say anything more when I'm talking to people sitting in South Africa.
Maybe, I don't know if I can...
Yes, please go ahead.
Jump in here and maybe to continue a bit on what Peter was just saying. We need to fix something globally. If you had one thing to fix in priority, what would it be?
Yeah.
Is it WHO? Is it making sure that when you have a vaccine, they are fairly distributed worldwide? What would it be?
It's about the whole multilateral system, from what goes on in New York right through the various agencies. But it's more than that. It's somehow getting politicians to accept it's in their vested self-interest to address the issues of the global commons. And that, sadly, particularly in the climate change, is something that's not really been achieved, particularly from the major producers.
Sorry, may I add on one more question which worried me seriously? It is number of people on the earth. We have almost 8 billion already. And that means that all this problem, climate changes, diseases, everything, it will growing very fastly because, you see, if you're increasing the number of people, they need fresh water, they need everything. And this is something which nobody mentioned anymore. But
let's talk about what we can fix, though. And one of the things we need to be honest about is the science system itself. The science system itself has been self-serving. Despite what is said, most of the science which is done in the name of sustainability is still very much about traditional science of just adding one more brick to the wall of knowledge. And that's fine. But what we actually need is actionable science now, which meets the needs of both the whole world, global north and global south. And actionable science needs transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches. It needs global funding mechanisms. It needs long-term funding. We can put a lot of money into CERN to have a global approach to finding out about what's after the Higgs boson, but we don't put that money into global efforts, truly global efforts to address issues like food security, water security, how we actually will get the behavioral change necessary for energy security and climate and dealing with emissions. Yes, we'll put money into finding batteries, but what about the practical things in societies that will be affected?
I wanted to come in some time ago, but I think the traffic was a bit societal rootedness of the scientific and establishment that we are talking, the scientific enterprise itself. Also not simply, working on the, if you like, the problems that serve the reproductive interests of the scientific enterprise itself, like cosmological physics, particle physics, building larger colliders and so on, all of which are absolutely important because that's just the quest of the human population, that we want to know where we come from, what the world is made up, and so how the universe works and so on. But we are also living the here and the now. And we have an important stewardship responsibility towards not just the present, but also future generations, and not just the elites, but the millions of billions of people on our planet. And so connecting that scientific enterprise with societies, with communities, is as an important bulwark against the sort of anti-science reactions that we've seen in the anti-vaccine debates, for example, a sense of disillusionment by a lot of ordinary people, in inverted commas. I really don't like that term ordinary because I think we are all extraordinary in a way, but common citizens that are not part of this establishment, to be able to identify with the utility of science and technology, its social purposes, and also themselves as animators in the makings of the science of the future, so to speak. This whole notion of citizen science, I know it's an overwaxed term, but nonetheless, I find it has great utility, usefulness in a context where you've seen this proliferation of the participation of all common people, citizens like ourselves, in debates about vaccines, about non-pharmaceutical interventions, about how the state must look after citizens, about issues of equity and so on. We've seen citizens participate, whether we like it or not. This is the world that we inhabit. And we're going to have to figure a way out in which traditional science making and science education and the scientific process itself has to mediate with the sort of, aspirations of citizens to want to be part of the scientific and technological game of the future, so to speak, as well. So I do think this thing about people's science, community science, citizen science, is crucial as a nexus, to enable us to break out of elite perceptions about science, where scientific advisors like ourselves sit with government leaders at the apex of society and make decisions that we deem to be to the benefit of society, but which are invariably contested, by citizens on the ground as well. And some of the things that my colleagues raised about the need for us to, first of all, Peter, you raised this point that I was also going to make, that there are different pathways to truth and claims that we make about understanding our world. I don't subscribe to the Dawkians, view of there's only one way. Of course, as a scientist, I have a particular way of looking at the world, but by no means I want to arrogate myself to say my way or the highway type of logic. And we need to find a discourse, a way to interact with those other sources of knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems, spiritual leaders, cultural activists. People have different ways of understanding their world and relating to their world. And if you can't find common ground to build a common understanding about how we can be responsible stewards for the earth, I think that would be an important part of it. And then the second point that I wanted to make, Himla, on this is humility. I think, Peter, you raised this issue. It's absolutely important that when we do make claims, whether it's about the virus itself, understanding it, and also how to respond to it, whether it's vaccines or antiviral therapies or other kinds of pharmaceutical interventions, to be able to frame that in a way that is humble and also conditional and provisional also, because there's just a lot of things we just simply don't know. We also don't know what we don't know, and there are often things that we currently do that have unintended consequences, even if we thought that in a logical way, cause and effect, the way the world works. And it is therefore very crucial that we don't set up the scientific enterprise, on a pedestal that, would be so easily to dismantle just on the basis of all those conditionalities and provisionalities and so on. So I thought I wanted just to make those points as well. Thanks, Imla.
No, that's very important. And I think you're absolutely right that we need to now kind of bring in this co-creation of knowledge. I think it's a very important component that the scientific enterprise needs to incorporate. Because before modern science became popular, there was an indigenous knowledge basis of how science or progress had come into place. And I mean, and this is cross-cutting across the different cultures. And then, the Western science kind of brought in a certain perspective into the discussion. And given that science follows the money, and that the money is mostly in, the developed world, we have all been sucked up into this gravitational pull of thinking in a Western way and forgetting some of the normatives of, what our different cultures had brought to the table. Which brings me to the point that I want to also raise is, given how the International Science Council and INGSA takes leadership on many, many activities, where's this voice of Africa in all of this? I mean, we seem to have a silence in, the academic and the scientists from the African continent having an opportunity to position their voices. Peter and Remy, do you have anything to say to this?
I'm conscious that the first workshop that INGSA ever held was held with Minister Naledi Pandor's assistants and ASAF's assistants in Hermanus, South Africa. There's been more workshops in both Francophone and Anglophone Africa from INGSA than anywhere else in the world. I think that we've worked hard to build the capacities at that interface in Africa. The ISC, I would note that two of the current board members are from Africa. One of the three patrons is from Africa. I think all the boards, all the committees of ISC involve African scientists. I think the multilateral system, and they're both young organizations in a sense, are working hard to try and be global organizations. I think that we work really hard at that. It's never going to be perfect. And I think we need to see, and part of the problem, of course, is scientists in the developing world are resource poor. And so they're so busy trying to compete for resource to do what they need to do domestically, then having the energy and to be brought is an issue that both INGSA and ISC are both constantly trying to redress. So I don't know, Remy, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, maybe I could just add that kind of as a new president, certainly one of the top priority for me and for the organization is a focus on Africa. continuing to build capacity in science advice, but maybe a bit of a different type of science advice post-pandemic, as we just discussed. We'll need you. We'll need support from South Africa and from many other countries in Africa. Challenges are certainly there, but it's certainly top priority for us. And if I may, and I will just use 2-3 minutes to give an example outside of Africa, but just in terms of some of the things we did in Quebec with the younger generation, with let's say 15 to 25, that basically were not going to take the vaccine and all that. So they were the most reluctant. Why was that? Well, basically because we had not talked to them. And they had press conference of the premier every day. It was in the news quite regularly. They don't watch TV, they don't listen to radio, they don't read paper. So we were missing that audience. So basically we said, okay, we'll give you to some group a bit of support, and you start your own thing on social media. They don't have gray hair. So that way, and that they use their language to their community, and that was very, very effective. And certainly now we want to do the same for climate change.
Yeah. Another question, and this is open to everyone. There's been a kind of move in South Africa over the last couple of years, particularly from the university base, about decolonizing science. What are your views on how we can decolonize science, working towards what Derek also said, bringing in that other voice of inclusivity from different cultures, including indigenous knowledge? What can we do to decolonize science? Or do you firstly believe that that is an issue that we need to address?
It was getting at the solution ultimately, and there are different languages to explain it. But science is science, but it has been used as a tool in many societies for other reasons. And I'm not sure I like the term Western science, because I think Chinese, Arab, Indian science has played an awful large part in the modern science enterprise over more than 1,000 years. So I think it's a term that's unfortunate. But I think that the issue of what Derek was referring to as community engagement, which I would refer to in a more technical sense as transdisciplinary science, where you bring the stakeholders into this framing of the questions and designing of the solutions, is the only way through this. The only way to do this is because once you bring in the stakeholders, be them indigenous people, be them, again, I don't try to avoid the word ordinary, like people from different societies or different identities, and allow them to help frame the question, you're immediately getting away from that model, a fixed model. And transdisciplinary science, transdisciplinary activity has to be the way through the wicked problems, because ultimately the wicked problems are the problems that people across the planet, all 8 billion people, are worrying about, and be them in low-income countries or disadvantaged people in high-income countries. The wicked problems of intergenerational disadvantage, of deprivation, educational debt, etc., all can only be changed by taking a transdisciplinary approach.
Yeah, I know.
Imla, may I come in as well?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, my own view is there probably a variety of different ways in which one can address this issue. So there's no sort of one bullet that solves all problems in the decolonization of science issue, which I support the notion. And I think one way in which you can tackle this is for African scientists and scientific establishments to club together to create platforms broader than their own nation states that can pool together resources to train the next generation of African scientists to work on these transboundary problems that Peter spoke about and other colleagues as well. That could look at the impact, for example, on those big grand challenges, so to speak, those intractable problems that are facing our people and our planet, of climate change and degraded biodiversity challenges, issues of food security, of water management, of building more robust healthcare systems that are peculiar and specific to the conditions that obtain in different parts of the continent. And if we club together 1.3 billion people and we co-invest in this, then we can lift the floor on R&D-I investment in the fundamental and applied scientific infrastructures that are so crucial for Africa to be able to take its own in the stock of knowledge of the world and being able to work with our colleagues elsewhere. So I do think we as Africans, we need to think not along nationalist terms. We need to think in continental terms, because the problems, as I was arguing earlier on, simply transcend those boundaries and they affect our populations. Look at the issue of migration, for example, climate migration, for example, or the radiation of pathogens, as a result of the spread of viruses and so on. So these problems, I think, provide an extraordinary laboratory for us to be able to craft a new way to solve these problems, different from the way that we've tackled it before. South Africa is just too small to be able to have that capacity for heavy lifting on this. So I do think we need to work together as Africans and figure a way out to overcome our own historic boundaries itself. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and just listening to what you're all saying seems logical in the context of a discussion like this. But we must remember that scientists are viewed in the scientific world by a whole suite of other indices. And one of the things we need to change is this global view of the value of science. We are walking the road to the World Science Forum that will be hosted in South Africa next year. And I'm sure that this kind of topic on the value of the intersection, the nexus between science and policy, and the players like politicians, civil society, business, public, and all of that will come into play. And so I just want to give each of you a minute to give me your soundbite for what would be the message that you would want our listeners to walk away from this discussion in the context of what we were talking about. And I'll start with Anna, please.
You see, my main message is research and science is fun. And I want that everybody, and people also who are not engaged in research, can understand that it's really wonderful thing. And many things which we have in our nowadays life, we receive from science. Look, all these small things, there's the laptops, everything. If you look also our famous phone, from what it came, not from God, but from people. So please think about this. It will help us all to live more easily. But another thing is, science is international. You cannot put in the science some kind that it is the national science, it is something like science is only international, including all part of world.
Thank you, and Miyoko?
Yes, thank you. So we are learning a lot from COVID-19 pandemic. I learned that it is quite important to notice that what we can do. Scientists, politicians, and citizens, all the people should think of their own role and responsibility and act what we can do. One more important thing we notice it from the pandemic, that is trust in people and things. We have to increase the trust in scientists, politicians, and citizens by communicating with each other. Furthermore, we should increase trust in scientific evidence. We need trust in people, science, data, evidence, decision-making, or citizens' actions, etc. in our society. So many things really need trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Remy?
Maybe I'll say inclusivity, being more inclusive, scientists from the north, scientists from the south working together, but very importantly, although the term maybe is not optimal, citizen science, inclusivity, including civil society, would be very important to move forward.
Thank you. Peter?
Science has shown that it is a truly global community, and I think we need to continue to develop that further, fill some of the void gaps that are there, which you alluded to in your question before. But it is a global community, and without that global community working together, the problems that the planet faces cannot be addressed. Now that is a challenge, because it comes back to the original topic of this session, of this whole session. How do we have greater impact from the scientific community? And that means working together in a less arrogant way.
Thank you. Derek, please come in.
I think, thanks, Imla and colleagues. I think if we could figure a way out to design the rules of a global system that can link science to society and science to governments in a way that can appeal to those intrinsic traits that have made our species so spectacularly successful, and also, in inverted commas, so destructive also over 300,000 years of our evolutionary history, being a cooperative species. If we can find a way to design the rules of this new global system that can appeal to those inherent traits that are hardwired and softwired in our DNA, about collaboration, about sharing our resources in the commons, about our mutual interdependence, about our common futures, and of course to build, as Remy was saying, a more inclusive global humanity. If we can figure out a way how to do that, I think in all the cultures, in all the religious systems, in all the scientific systems of the world, there are points of agreement between us to be able to work together to become common stewards of the earth. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. Wow. I told you at the beginning, I feel like a kid in the candy store or on Christmas Eve waiting to unpack my presents. You all have certainly delivered your packages into my brain, into my heart, into the psyche of all those who were privileged to listen to you. I think your honesty, your freedom of thought, your engagement has really, really shared what the ideal world should be at this core interface of how we bridge the gap and build the bridge between the science environment on the one hand and the policy, politics, and the common good on the other. I am humbled to have been asked to moderate this session, and I think you have given us a lot of food for thought. I hope that the thoughts that they have shared with us penetrate into your hearts and into your brain to bring about the change that is necessary, and hope that we have an opportunity to engage in the rundown to World Science Forum, and that we have an opportunity to meet face to face. Thank you all, and thank you, Aidan, also for allowing me this privilege. Bye for now. Take care all.